Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our conference on the future of food, urban bioeconomies in Europe and America. And we're so happy to have you out early this morning, and hope you can stay with us as much of the day as possible. I'm Don Crafton. I'm the interim director of the Nanovic Institute, and the origin of this idea came early in the fall when the staff and I were brainstorming about ways that we could use some money that was available from the European Union delegation. And my colleague Anthony Manta immediately said, well, we should do something with sustainable agriculture and food. And that really resonated. It just seemed so intuitively correct. My own experiences as I travel through Europe is that the slow food movement is very big, very important, and very controversial. The attention to detail in agriculture in Europe is astonishing. Even as you're flying over the continent, you can look down from 30,000 feet and see just fields and fields of windmills. And I'm not talking about just Holland either. These are power windmills that clearly are generating energy to an extent that we really have only started to dream of in the States. Also, when you're driving through, say, Germany, as I was a couple of weeks ago, the rich agricultural area around Heidelberg is beautifully, rationally laid out farmland with extraordinarily straight rows of asparagus and strawberries and things like that, all meticulously mounded up with material to protect them from the frost and so on, and also obviously arranging them so that they can be mechanically harvested and weeded. So it doesn't look anything like a typical American farm as you're driving through Indiana, though there are parts of our country where you can see massive agriculture like that, but typically those are probably going to be, in partnership with Monsanto or something. What we would like to do in our symposium today is really just to get the conversation started about urban bioeconomies and what American farmers, North American farmers, I should say, can learn from the European example, but also what our European colleagues can learn from the American experience, and specifically the indigenous farms of Michiana. So let me just pause a little bit to say that there's a certain irony in my being up here because, as my bio says in the program, in fact, I am farm raised and free range. I grew up in a small farm town in Michigan, about 135 miles from here. And my folks had settled there to work in the auto industry, but before that, they were migrant farm workers. And they would go through the fruits and vegetable corridor from Texas up through Washington and then swing back. So I did that about 4 times in my early youth before we settled in Michigan. And to, help make things meet. Of course, working on the assembly line was very lucrative comparatively, so we were relatively well off after that. But to make things meet for my own needs, I took the jobs that were available for a teenage kid in rural Michigan, and that included such things as going on my hands and knees in the muck fields and weeding the onion sets, which had to be done 2 or 3 times during the season. These rows are about a mile long. Get to the end, turn around, come back on your hands and knees. That was 50 cents an hour, and I thought, well, this is really not enough. So the next summer I went to work on the pickle ranch in a grading station, taking the cucumbers that the workers had brought in from the field, putting them in the grater, and then they would sort them according to the various sizes. So even today I can look at the jar of pickles in the grocery store and say, well, that's a number 3. Also, if you see any dark spots on the pickles, don't buy that jar. But I guess one of the things I took from this was maybe two big lessons I can think of. One is, since I was working shoulder to shoulder with the braceros, who were doing the primary heavy lifting in agriculture in the 1960s, one inevitable lesson was that these people who are not like me, who speak a language that I can't understand and they can't understand a word that I say, are just people. People are people, and you have the good and the bad and the ugly, no matter who you talk to. And certainly it was a lesson, I would say, in the universality and the commonality that physical labor engenders. The other important lesson I took from this as I was lifting the crates of cucumbers and putting them into the grading machine is I think I want to be a university professor. So that changed my life too, in a way. So anyway, pardon my digression, but I think that there's going to be a lot of passion, a lot of memories, and a lot of creation of memories for the future that come out of the symposium today. I would certainly like to express my deep gratitude to the European Union delegation, which is based in Washington, D.C., which is generously supporting this event. And also thanks to the Ham's Notre Dame bookstore, we are offering a variety of books for your perusal that relate to the topic at hand. And some of the authors are here and will happily sign copies for you. You will also, just a housekeeping note for the presenters, don't rush off immediately to lunch because we're going to round you up for a group photo up here beforehand. Speaking of lunch, you need to have registered beforehand to participate. And if you have any questions about your registration, our members will be happy to help you. We would, of course, as usual, like to thank Harriet Baldwin and all of the wonderful helpers here in the McKenna Conference Center. And I personally would like to thank Anthony Manta for his leadership and his vision and his hard work, and also our wonderful and capable staff who were true collaborators with Anthony and who made this all happen. And especially I would like to thank, of course, our distinguished and welcome visitors and experts. But for that, I will turn it over to Anthony Manta. So please enjoy your day.
Well, welcome everyone. I just want to say a few brief words about the format today and our presenters. As you can see on the schedule, we have different categories of presentations. In each category, we'll have several speakers. The speakers will talk for about 10 to 12 minutes. This is kind of by design. It's a challenge for professors to do this. It's a challenge for anybody to do it and to do it well. But the hope here is that after the presentations, we'll have lots of time for dialogue and questions. This is final exam week at Notre Dame. We knew this going into the event, and we wanted to invite the community here and to make this symposium as rich an experience as it can be for you. The expertise, the experience that the speakers have is available to you. So there are microphones here, as you can see at the back of these tables. If you have questions, reactions, comments, please come to the microphone, and you are most welcome after the presentations to engage with the speakers and the rest of the speakers here seated before you in conversation. The speakers today are a wonderful group. First, we'll have Professor Felipe Fernandez Armesto, who is a historian here at Notre Dame, the Reynolds Professor of History. He will be speaking on the history of food. He's written a wonderful book, which won the National Prize for Gastronomy in Spain, among other awards. It's available outside. And he will be followed by Will Allen, who's the founder and CEO of Growing Power in Milwaukee. After this, we'll have a short break, and we will turn to considerations of the farm and the city from a more global perspective. Lucien Stahl from the School of Architecture will be here. Jean Joho from Everest in Chicago and other restaurants will speak about connecting small farmers to urban restaurants. The mayor of South Bend will be here later on at 11:30 to talk about the initiatives that have been happening in the South Bend community that support urban agriculture. And then we will, as Don said, have a lunch. And the lunch is going to be prefaced by some remarks by Don Miller, the executive chef at Notre Dame, who has won some awards for the sustainable sourcing of food for our enormous campus food services. In the afternoon, as you can see, we'll have a member of the EU delegation here with us, Giulio Menato. He is the first counselor for agricultural affairs. He will be speaking and making a presentation about food quality policies in the EU, and then other issues having to do with food policy and larger considerations will follow, connecting small farmers to urban markets, dealing with the issue of scale, with Norman McCowan, the president of Bell Aquaculture here in Indiana. And then at the end, we'll hear from the grassroots in Europe. Two extraordinary people from Berlin, Marco Clausen and Elisabeth Calderon-Luning, will be here to talk about the Prinzessinnengarten, which is located in Kreuzberg in Berlin. They have created something really special. And we'll talk about the social dimensions and the interesting problems that arise when spontaneous agriculture crops up in cities. And then we'll have a closing panel discussion, wide-ranging, to talk about the practical effects of things. So this is a large day. I hope you can stay for all of it. Enjoy. Our first presenter will be Felipe Fernandez Armesta.
Have me. I can't tell you what a treat it is to be here with all these distinguished fellow conférenciers. I mean, there are people here who produce and cook food. I just eat it. And so I feel very humble. I also feel tremendously grateful to be summoned back to a research topic that makes my grocery bills tax deductible. The pleasure that I feel at being here is, however, considerably attenuated by the fact that Anthony has told us we've only got 10 minutes. And the history of food is a very long subject. I mean, biota have been devouring other biota on this planet for something like 5 billion years. So that's roughly 500 million years a minute. So instead of trying to cover the whole field, I'm going to pick out a few episodes in the history of food from a strictly human perspective, which impinge on the world we inhabit in urban environments today, this world of extremes of excess and deprivation, which my first slide is intended to evoke. And obviously, one has to start a mere 12,000 years or so ago, which is just a blip in the history of the planet, with the first great revolution in humans' relationship with what they eat that made cities possible. And that, of course, is the invention of agriculture, the shift from procuring food to producing it, because although there were foragers who could lead sedentary lives in conditions of exceptional abundance, you would never be able to sustain city life until you had large-scale agrarian production and warehousing. And I show you this picture of snails really in advocacy of my own pet theory that agriculture originated with the first domesticated food source that humans developed were mollusks, a theory which not all specialists have yet come to accept. Fortunately, I don't have time to urge it on you now. We can discuss it subsequently if you like. Now, obviously, this is a very big deal, because when humans intervened in the environment to produce new species by speciation and hybridization, it was a revolution in the literal sense of the word, because they were reversing evolution. They were creating a world in which what I call unnatural selection, so hybridization, selectivity, was yielding new species. And the same characteristic, this characteristic of human interventions which procure massive reversals of evolution, is also a characteristic of my second great revolution, which has only occupied the last 500 years. I mean, this isn't even the scraping of a fingernail in the history of the planet, but it's also a very big deal. And I refer, of course, to what historians tend to call the ecological exchange of the modern era. The shift of biota, which accompanied essentially European long-range navigation, exploration, migration, and empire building. And obviously this ecological exchange encompassed a lot more than just food sources. It encompassed disease-bearing microbes in a very big way. It encompassed human beings themselves. It encompassed animal sources of labor. But above all, the story is primarily a story of the shift of edible biota. And amongst the consequences, I don't have time to divagate on, are obviously, these tremendous cultural innovations where you get these national cuisines which are composed of foodstuffs which just are not indigenous to the lands where they've become symbolic, iconic. But the more important consequence for our present purposes was a tremendous increase in the food sources available in the world, because when you swap biota, you multiply the food sources that are available in any one ecozone. So people have the food resources to survive ecological disasters in a way that had never been possible before. And that's essentially why, obviously there are some other influences involved. That's essentially why the population explosion that we're still experiencing today begins in the 18th century. With the result that was obvious in the last slide, people begin to worry about this demographic explosion exceeding food resources, and that's a phenomenon very marked amongst theorists of the late 18th century. I obviously here, most famous of them all is Malthus. Now, how did people escape from this dilemma of ecological exchange producing a threat of overpopulation? Well, essentially, I think it was the result of what I call an energy revolution in the 19th century, provoked, in my submission, by a crisis of lipids, a fat crisis of the 19th century, which has gone almost unnoticed by historians, except me. And I'm sorry to show you this picture of whaling, ladies and gentlemen, because I can't deny that I have a personal vested interest to declare in this. My son, who's a playwright, it's just about to close, but he's adapted Moby Dick for the stage. But it's not for that reason that I show you this image. It's primarily because, until the mid-19th century, whaling was the world's main source of lipids. You imagine what it was like in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in an era of demographic explosion and of industrialization, where you've got a supply. Fat is the best source of energy. You've got to supply energy for this growing population, and you've got to grease the wheels, literally, of industrialization and of militarization. It's another big 19th century phenomenon. And you've got to do it essentially, obviously there are other sources of fat, but our main source of fat is this stuff which you go out and you harpoon at tremendous risk in these tiny little shells of Bates, and the Moby Dick story is highly representative of this moment in our past. Well, people got over this fat crisis by exploiting new sources of lipids. Here we see palm oil production. Again, it's something which is unnoticed in the historiography, but one of the main reasons why European imperialism takes off in the tropics in the 19th century is in order to secure palm oil resources to supplement the otherwise inadequate sources of fats. And obviously, petroleum production begins in the mid-19th century, and artificial fats like margarine are invented. So there's a whole range of new sources of fats coming into the world. And there's also this huge extension of cultivable land and land used for raising livestock. And I illustrate this with the North American prairie. Because if you look at the planet from the perspective of that creature of my imagination, whom I call the galactic observer, and asked her what was the really big thing that she would notice from her immense distance of time and space, from an objectivity of viewpoint inaccessible to us who are living on the hide of the planet and immersed in its history, I think she would say, I don't call her feminine by a feminine pronoun for reasons of political correctness, it's just that in my own household the only omniscient being is female. If you ask the galactic observer what happened that was really big, she would say the domestication of the North American prairie, because, still in the 1820s, when Stephen Long was surveying it and James Fenimore Cooper was writing about it, it was the great American desert, and by the application of industrial techniques, it was transformed into the breadbasket of the world. Well, I don't have time to divagate on the consequences of this, but essentially what happened was that the world overcame the energy crisis by these means, and also by means of industrialization, by substituting mechanical power for muscle power. And the result was a superabundance, at least in some parts of the world, of fats and carbohydrates which had previously been deficient. And the most conspicuous effect today has been on a kind of aesthetic effect, a revolution in our aesthetics of fat. I'm showing you here a painting by, surely, the greatest iconographer of fat in the history of the world, and that's Fernando Botero. And you can see how this dietary fat, which in every other culture apart from ours, has been prized as the best food, and the most socially prestigious food, has become demonized. Now all our images of fat-rich foods are now, sinister and deadly. I think Renoir, was the last painter to paint purely aesthetic, purely innocent and lovely images of bodily fat. Now, Botero, when he paints fat people, always, kind of suffuses the images with these deadly, threatening, menacing traits. Whereas in every other society, fat has been beautiful. Here's the Venus of Loisel, who represents the last 20,000 years of prevailing aesthetic in the world. Whereas now, if you want a comparable example, comparable icon of perfect beauty, you'd have to go to that. A creature. Well, if you had breasts as big as Barbies and legs as thin, you just topple over by your own weight. Obviously, industrialization contributes to this transformation of the world from paucity to abundance of food. But the results are very ill-distributed around the world. Here, some Indian famine victims of the Great Famine of 1895. As famines became almost perennial problems of the world towards the end of the 19th century. And a further series of revolutions in the 20th century contributed to the solution of those inequalities, primarily the invention of nitrogen-based fertilizers by Fritz Haber in 1909. people said it was like plucking food from the air because he turned this very common element, which is just all around us, into fertilizers, with disastrous consequences in many respects, but, you know, it solved the world's food deficiency problems. Because until this time, there was very little in the way of artificial fertilizer. Pretty much the world relied for fertilizer on guano, in other words, mining bird shit off the Peruvian coast. It's not, you know, this wasn't adequate to the needs of the world until Haber came along. And in the longer term, obviously the Green Revolution, and now the revolution represented by genetic modification is following up on the initiatives that Haber and his contemporaries launched. But of course, you know, both of these expedients have had deleterious, unforeseen consequences, and those consequences are quite liable to mount up in the long term. But I don't have time to divagate on them. I think they're very well known and familiar to everybody. Let me point out that the resulting abundance, however, has continued to be very unequal. And it's been exacerbated by two further revolutions, which are really not revolutions peculiarly in the context of food production, but they're huge, you know, social and cultural shifts of the 20th century. One is the consumer revolution. Now, in the 20th century, the population of the world increased by a factor of about 4. But total consumption increased in the same period by a factor of 19. And whenever I tell people this, they say, oh yeah, you know, he's from Notre Dame, it's a Catholic university, and this is part of an inquisitorial plot against contraception. It's not, ladies and gentlemen, these are facts. The reason why we are in a world of resource stress is over-consumption, and we don't know why this happened in the 20th century. And there are a lot of theories out there which we can discuss later if you like. I can't risk Antony's wrath by going through all the theories now, but that's the fact. And the other great revolution is, you know, the sort of the consequences, the atomizing consequences of large-scale urbanization, the rise of anomie, the disintegration of communities, and above all, families. And I call this the microwave effect, not because microwaves are entirely and solely responsible, but because it is characteristic of urban families nowadays that they no longer eat together. It's becoming increasingly characteristic. And obviously the microwave is one of the technologies that's really prominent in that shift. And I draw your attention to it because I think in a way it returns us to the beginning of the story. We're heading back to a world in which eating is no longer going to be social activity. I mean, I have students in this university who bring their lunches into my lectures, and instead of communing with each other over their meals, they're eating in a desperately solitary way and just looking at me, which I would have thought was extremely dyspeptic. And the same tendency to make social communities fissile is happening in people's homes because they're no longer eating together. In other words, we're going back to the pre-social world of our hominid ancestors before the invention of cooking and facing a society which isn't only riven by global food inequalities, problems of production, problems of sustainability, but also by very grave social and cultural consequences. I've got one other slide which I'll have to leave, I think, for the panel if we have time for it even then. I did it, you see? I did it. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Timothy. We do have a few minutes for questions and comments, and we have these 2 microphones sitting around. My understanding question.
Don, we have microphones back here too.
Even though we can hear you perfectly well because that's how you're recorded.
There are 2 microphones in the back here you're welcome to use.
We're also happy to run these around here in the center.
Professor, is the microwave culture you just described, is its continuation and advance inexorable? Because
I'm sorry?
Is the advance of the kind of microwave animistic culture that you're talking about inexorable? Is it going to continue on the same curve? I work with a lot of people in the good food movement who are trying to push society back in the other direction, and we see some consequences in the growth of interest in sustainable foods and the growth of farmers markets. More people are engaged in and interested in cooking. Can we turn the ship at all?
Well, thank you very much. I applaud, people who do that. And of course, there are a lot of people who are going to be participating in this conference who are very actively engaged in precisely, this struggle to alert people to the fact that food is for more than the nourishment. It's for magic, it's for ritual, it's for community building, it's for the enhancement of life in every sense of the word. But unfortunately, all of these efforts, wonderful as they are and successful as they are, as we're going to hear in many cases, have overall the effect of increasing food inequalities because they only reach a susceptible portion of the population, which so far looks like a minority. So I don't think the trend that I describe is irreversible by any means, and I'm not confident that we're yet seeing it reversed universally. And I mean that's one of the reasons why we've got these food deserts and these patches of desperate extreme food behaviors.
As you look through the history and go through, and then end with the slide, I'm struck by also the opportunity as we find new ways of sustaining ourselves, not only each of us but together. And as history repeats itself, what do you see in terms of that? I mean, we see Llewellyn, we see different things cropping up here in terms of food. Are you seeing a shift towards not only increased local food, but increased social opportunities?
Well, obviously, thank you very much. I mean, obviously, every challenge is an opportunity. I think, G.K. Chesterton said, a misfortune is only an adventure wrongly considered. But the really big changes which are going on at the moment are making the situation worse, not better. Genetic modification is increasing the wealth gap. The wealth gap is, in my opinion, the biggest problem facing the world, because that is the problem which is most likely to lead to vast global-scale violence. It's also, of course, endangering the environment, because it has all the interventions I've described, human interventions I've described in the environment so far, and many others I didn't have time for, have had unintended deleterious consequences. And although, I'm not an advocate of vacuous speculation, it isn't vacuously speculative to say that genetic modification is going to have these consequences. Every other such intervention has had them. And above all, the great tendency in the 20th century, put all the things I've mentioned together, has been to cheapen food. Which sounds great, cheap food, fantastic, let's all get to the trough. But, of course, that's precisely how people respond. Cheap food means impoverished farmers, especially in the third world. And it means, obese children in developed world food deserts. Food deserts in the sense that, there are areas in our cities where the food that's available locally is trash. And the food that's available within people's income range is repulsive rubbish. And it's poison, and it's corrupting. So I think, that one of the biggest problems we face is that food is too cheap. And I can't see that being reversed because, unfortunately, democracy has many advantages, but it has a terrible disadvantage that you can't, get votes by saying, I'm going to make food more expensive. So for all those reasons, and those which I gave in answer to the previous question, I'm very pessimistic about whether we're going to take the opportunities to which you rightly draw our attention. And the only consolation I can offer is that, pessimism is the best policy for happiness. It's only by being pessimistic that you can avoid disillusionment.
We have time for one more question, but there'll be lots of time throughout the day to come back.
Well, I guess I just wanted to comment on the trash food and the whole nutrition obesity connection. And I think that some would argue it's really not the fats that is causing the obesity problems. It's the carbohydrates. And when you talk about trash food, it really is a primarily carbohydrate diet you're talking about. And so one of the tenets of the local food movement, the things that we can grow initially using more hand labor, involve fruits, vegetables, and dairy products, which can be sourced from grass-fed cows. The dairy products can then be used to feed hogs and chickens without involving the carbohydrates in the cycle. And I'm not just saying this as sort of some Weston Price fanatic. I've been on a low-carb diet, and it's really better for you, I think, and does not contribute to obesity.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I hope I didn't give anybody the impression that I blame dietary fat for obesity. I mean, I'm all in favor of fat. I mean, let's hear it for fat. I mean, the whole point of my slides was to show that most societies have appreciated fat, and they've done that not because they're stupid, but because it is actually the best source of food in calorific value. It supplies 3 times as much as any other food source per unit of bulk. And that's it's a great treasure. But obviously, you mustn't eat too much of it. It's precisely because it's such a rich food source. And I absolutely agree with the tenor of the question that it's carbohydrate abuse more than fat abuse that leads to some of the dietary imbalances that yielded images that I showed you of life.
So I guess
today.
I'm asking you to make the connection between this shift to a lower carbohydrate and the equity question of how can we get this sort of a diet available to the masses?
I don't know. Metabolism's there. I never like to recommend particular diets to people. If people ask me, I always thought that, I always envy all these gurus who have, diets named after them, get, kind of millions of dollars for what is just usually very plain, simple, common sense advice. I mean, the Felipe diet is definitely worth, millions and millions of dollars. And it's very simple. Eat less.
For that literally engrossing and emphasis. Now it's my pleasure to bring up Will Allen, the CEO of Growing Health.
We will start with a short video.
Oh, we will start with the short video.
Is that it?
Food is such a powerful way of bringing people together. When I graduated high school, I had over 100 scholarship offers. And my goal was to get an education and play professional basketball. And I said, I'll never go back to that farm. We're able to move from less than 1% of local food production to 10%. That was $1 billion change. We're growing energy here. We're growing soil. We're growing people, and we're growing a community because we're anchored here in a community that badly needs food. So part of it, this whole concept is really about growing community as well as providing the most important thing to all of us, which is our food. My mother's family was in farming. My father was a sharecropper, but unlike many African American males at that time, he wanted myself and my brothers to know where our food came from, and for practical reasons, to be able to grow our own food.
As we sit here today, we're losing rural farmland and we're losing farms. 1 million since 1960.
Actually, I was driving down the street here at the time, back in 1993. I was working for Procter & Gamble in sales and sales technology, and I just saw the for sale sign, and I stopped and I wrote down the number. You know, I said to myself, this is the place that I could land, and that's when I got in trouble. I knew a little bit about the area. 5 blocks away is the largest housing project we have here in Milwaukee, called West Lawn. It was pretty much what is called a food desert, and the only access to food is corner stores and what they call fast food swamps.
As a matter of fact, many of our kids are eating food that grandmothers wouldn't recognize as food.
I was just in Cleveland. I met with the mayor of Cleveland, and he really gets it.
We're starting to get a lot of waste from food wholesalers. They throw away thousands and thousands of pounds of food waste a week.
I want the same food to go to all people in all communities, and to do that, you have to figure out ways of reducing the production costs. And part of that is what we do here in terms of growing soil by using renewable energy to keep the cost in line so we can get that food to everybody at a reasonable cost. People come here, they want to know, how did you do that? You know, how did you make that happen on these 3 acres? How can we do that? This farm system is a unique farm system. It's part of, I think, Ag of the Future in terms of how we grow food here very intensively, using every square foot and everything that we discover, we pass on to folks that come here. It's not like we want to stick it in some closet and try to make money off of it. Everything we discover, we pass on to other folks.
I don't think I've ever interviewed anyone who was officially named a genius by a major foundation. How did you find out that you were getting the MacArthur Genius Award?
In our city, we have a lot of vacant land. In the Midwest, there's hundreds and hundreds and even thousands of acres inside cities. Cities like Detroit, cities like Youngstown, Ohio, Buffalo, New York, Chicago, where they have 77,000 vacant lots, some 33 square miles of vacant land. Then we can grow food.
I always believed in having a diverse group of folks to work with, so diversity is at the top of my agenda. One of the declarations I made with the city was that I would hire kids from the community. Then we started being looked at as an asset to the community because we were providing jobs.
I live 10 blocks up, and I used to walk past here every day when I was in high school to go to the basketball court. And one day I just stopped in, loved it here. I would have never thought I would be doing something like this, but I love it.
Whoever wants help, whether they're from Detroit or some small rural community in Alabama or Mississippi or upstate in Wisconsin, we engage those communities. So it's not just inner city, it's not just urban, it's rural communities that are hurting today as well. But it's really all about food. and how we are going to try to change the existing food system to make it something that really works for everybody. People think because they spend a lot of money for food, that food is fresh and good. But we know when food travels many miles, it loses a lot of its nutrient value, and the system that we need is to go back to those days where a food system was local. A sustainable food system is the only way to really end hunger in the world. The industrial food system, it hasn't worked.
We have to change our food policy, our national food policy. And to do that, we need concrete projects like this and others around the country to change policy. We just can't keep them running DC and standing in line and trying to lobby for something. We have to prove that this works. We have to prove that this cash flows.
It's something that we need to continue to grow. There's some challenges that we have to overcome to make it grow. Being a former athlete, you know, I like competition and I like challenges. I've always wanted to guard the best player, take the last shot in the game or whatever. And I like that kind of challenging. And if you can transfer that over into something like this, it becomes a very powerful and good thing for the community.
Ladies and gentlemen, Will Allen.
Thank you. Where's Felipe? There he is. I'm going to take Felipe's lead because I really like his style. Instead of going up there and talking to you, you know, stand down close to where, down on the grassroots where this work is done and where we should be. And I like his style because of his images. Didn't he have some great images? You know. So what I'm going to do we have a clicker somewhere? Because of the limited time, usually my presentations that I do, I was just in St. Louis day before yesterday and did a presentation. It'd take about an hour and a half sometimes, maybe 40 days and 40 nights because my PowerPoint is like 1,062 slides. I don't know if anybody's seen a. So I'm going to show you a few slides today, but the work that I do, we're in our 21st year doing urban agriculture. It started in 1993 when I bought the last remaining farm in the city of Milwaukee. So we moved along a continuum and really passing on to folks in the local community and getting engaged in Milwaukee and now all over the world. But during that journey, the thing that I think is the most powerful thing in all of our lives is, of course, our food. Even though a lot of us take it for granted, our food is the most important thing that really makes us what we are. And there are going to be some great speakers that will talk about that from Europe. And I really got reconnected to food in Belgium, where I played my last stint of professional basketball. And one of my teammates, I went out to his farm. When I said when I left at 18 I would never farm again because, you know, it has to be a better life. Just like what Don was saying earlier, leaving farming to become a professor. But once I went out to this family farm, I touched the ground and I realized there was some hidden passion and it was something I wanted to do, and I started actually growing food in Belgium. And I fed the other Americans that were playing on Belgium's small country, so I knew all the other players. I competed against all the other Americans, and I would pass on food to them, doing the same thing that my family did, growing food and passing it on to folks in our family, extended family, and community. So, and that's basically what we're doing today at Growing Power, but we're doing it in a different kind of way. And engaging everybody in our community to be able to have access to the same food, because that's my goal. Not to have areas in our community where you can only eat certain types of food and have access to certain types of food. So that's what over the last 20 years we've been able to do. by getting food to restaurants, to stores, through our CSA Market Basket program that we can drop food in any community in Milwaukee, Chicago, and Madison, Wisconsin are 3 areas that we market in. So what I'm going to do without further ado of talking about the food system, but I will tell you one thing. I think where the rubber really meets the road is really about the nutritional value of our food, and that's really where it's at. And everybody that's eating food today, there's nobody can tell you the actual nutritional value of the food that you're going to eat, that you have eaten, and that's something that we have to come to terms with. And it really all starts with the soil. It's all about the soil. So if, a lot of things you'll hear today about food and everything, it's really all about the soil. That's where you get the great taste. That's where you get the nutrition. And we're going to have to start quantifying, what is the nutritional value of the food? And I was surprised when I asked medical professionals from both of our medical schools and our School of Public Health at UW-Milwaukee to join me and doing some of this quantification of what is the nutritional value of food, and we're going to go through 150 different crops that we grow and compare it with stuff that's shipped in from all over the world into our market, because you see only less than 1% of the food that we consume in Milwaukee is locally grown. So we're eating all this food that's shipped in and we have no idea of the nutritional value of that food, and that's why local food production, fish production, that you'll hear from Norman today about the amazing things that they're doing on a local level is so important. We have to get control of where our food comes from, and as we move along, if we want to really end, I believe the only way to end a healthcare crisis in this country and all over the world is with eating good food. For me, that's the way we're going to do it. We can talk about all the other things and talk about how shifting dollars from one program to another, but it really boils down to our food and how we're going to do it through food. And I'm excited because this next generation wants to do it. You know, over 70% of the folks that are now engaged in local food movement around the country, and that's why I call my book The Good Food Revolution, because it truly is a revolution now, are folks under the age of 40. 70%. So it gives me great hope that this next generation will lead the way and pass on what some of us academics who have been studying the food system and crusty old farmers like myself to this next generation. So let me go and try to, I'm going to be moving really fast. Faster than Felipe, by the way. I'm faster than him, even though I have a hip replacement and a knee replacement and all that stuff. Okay, one of these things works. Okay. I bought the last remaining farm in 1993, and these were the young people, and there's some difference between these young people and the young people today that I'll tell you what it is real quick. They have their pants pulled up. That's the difference. And we started growing soil and rehabbing this old facility back then because, again, it's all about the soil. So we grow a lot of soil and worm castings. We now have over 7,000 pounds of worms on this farm, worth about $300,000 to break down our compost. And then we started aquaponics. Norman, this is how we started, a 3-barrel configuration. One was a weed tank, one was a fish tank. You could, and the filter tank, and you could grow 50 tilapia in about 6 months. And this was a system that was a heifer project that could go into people's homes anywhere in the world to grow. We also did a lot of bedding plants and did a lot of projects around the city. And one of the things I noticed with many of these young people didn't have reading skills, so we would have them come and write about what they just did in a very physical way and how to use tools. And then more kids started showing up. And I also work with the juvenile justice system. These kids have come back into our society and use this as a therapy piece for these young people. And we'd take our bedding plants, the kids, and plant around the community. This was at Neighborhood House. It took up a complete block, and they had car thefts, and we removed the shrubs, and all of a sudden the car thefts went away because people started looking at the flowers, and the car thieves felt uncomfortable, and that remediated that problem. And then we would take vacant lots where drug dealers would hang out and engage the community in one day, bring in about 75 yards of compost and do these what I call flower explosions way back then. And then native communities would come down and we would work with them. And on the south side of Chicago where there was a murder a day in Inglewood. And in 1995, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel wrote a front page story about me working. I was volunteering at that time, and it kind of brought us into the turn of the century when growing power really started growing. So this is what our facility looks like today from those days. We're powered by a lot of renewable energy. We also work with a large housing project 5 blocks away that's been reconstructed into a mixed income community where we operate a 30,000 square foot garden, community garden, that the residents grow food in. And we also have a waste pickup of food waste from the apartments as a pilot project for Milwaukee that I've talked to the mayor about rolling out throughout the whole city. We call this a community food center. A community food center is a place where people can come and learn about how to grow food and get inspired. We're also a multicultural, multi-generational organization, which is really important that we're engaging. And these are some of the people that visit Growing Power. Over 30,000 visitors last year. So I'll go through this really quick. And actually, some of the people in this room have been to Growing Power and participated in some of our training. We have 3 major training programs that we do once a month from January through May. And these guys even show up. And workshops. Project planning, important thing. As I go around the country, people bring out their plans from several years ago and their farm looks exactly like mushroom, learning how to do mushrooms. It's something that you learn at the hands-on workshop because the only way to learn how to farm is in a hands-on way. You can't learn how to do it in a classroom. You have to do it, actively do it in growing soil, composting. It's something that we teach people in the smallest configuration to get the temperatures up to 150 degrees. And we always put somebody up there to compact it to make sure we get maximum use of that 4x4 configuration. And people are fascinated by worms, of course, which is so important to sustainable agriculture. And these 4 barrel configurations are pretty much accepted with the mesh, wire, and it's all about locally grown food. So we celebrate food. If you come to Growing Power, we serve the meals throughout the weekend, all the meals. And this guy, you've seen them. They're the ones that pick up, they want us to think that they think green. They say they have over 17,000 acres of wildlife habitat. But the only thing I've seen when I go to the landfills, and I'm picking on them a little bit, are seagulls and really big rats. So I don't know what they're talking about. And diverting the waste, building the relationships just like they do. This year we did 40 million pounds of carbon and nitrogen into thousands of yards of compost where we grow our food. We don't grow in existing soil in the city. And we're able to compost over 1 million pounds at our national headquarters. And the reason people always ask me, how do you guys get away with that 200 feet away from the community where people live? And it's all about engaging the community, that they're on board. They understand what you're doing. And then we have these rural, larger scale composting sites in the rural community where we grow our soil to be able to grow our food. If we couldn't grow soil, I couldn't farm because it's irresponsible to grow inside cities or even in suburban and rural areas if you're going to do sustainable agriculture in contaminated soil. It's all about the soil. That's a worm depository. How's our time? That's a worm depository that has 400 yards of material. It'll produce 40,000 pounds of worm castings in a year. And this is what we do with our finished compost. We do it a little bit different. We first grow compost and then we put the worms in the compost. These red worms, 7 different varieties, break it down into worm castings. Aren't they beautiful? So these are our other employees. We have 140 human employees at Growing Power today, but we have about 140 billion of these employees. And I like them because they never talk back. They just go and do their work and produce a great product for you. And that's a cocoon where 20 worms come out of that cocoon every 4 months. They increase in population. It's a great transformative moment when you put 200 worms in a child's hands and it just changes their life right then and there. And even adults get into it. Look at this guy. So it's all about the soil. How's our time? Keep rolling? Okay, I'll keep rolling and you can ask questions as I keep going through this. And you know, I was in St. Louis for a talk before I came here. I didn't have a chance to stick some in my pocket, John, but next time I will.
Well, I just wanted to point out that what he's doing here is another way to get the protein and the fat, because you're going to feed the worms to the fish, I think. And, you know, so there's all kinds of creative ways that we could sort of circumvent the whole grain growing industrial annual agriculture thing.
Okay.
So that's
this is Norman. You'll appreciate this. From that 3-barrel configuration, we were able to convert this into a 10,000-gallon raceway system. It's called aquaponics, and we use the plants to remediate the waste from the fish, and you're able to have 10,000 tilapia. Here's our staff putting in some of the 10,000 fingerlings, yellow perch fingerlings that we get from the Great Lakes Institute to do our research and our grow out. And those are tilapia. That's what they look like. And that's what lake perch. They look pretty good, huh, Nora? And we're also experimenting with black pacu, Amazonian fish. And this is a picture of the Great Lakes Institute. Fingerlings, this is institute that helps, those are egg strands that will hatch out. And this is Dr. Binkowski, who we work with, and this great relationship we have with a major university and a community-based organization to be able to squeeze out the egg strand, and then he reaches over, grabs a male fish and squeezes a sperm into the eggs, and in this bowl he mixes it, and now they're fertilized. And you get the result. So he's training me how to do it at the Institute. And it's really cool, let me tell you. Okay, yes.
I have a question about your main goal with the accessibility. And as we've discussed, we're in the business of free food and free good food. So tell me a little bit more about growing power and how, you know, I know how we do it. We grow food that's accessible for everyone, and then use programming to support those free food model. Tell me a little bit more about how growing food connects all people in accessibility to healthy food.
Well, it's important to engage everybody in the community, and we have a marketing scheme to be able to get food to everybody in our community. So we really start with even preschool gardens. This year we're putting in free preschool gardens because kids need to get engaged in the taste of good food that's grown in good soil. So that's an important piece of our work. But over the 20 years, we have so many. We have over 70 different projects, and a lot of them are about making food accessible to everybody in the community, the same food, not just different food for different areas of economics in the city, but the same food at a reasonable price. And one of the ways for us to keep the price, and I don't know, Felipe alluded to that our food is too cheap. Well, if you're able to cut the production cost, that's what it's all about. When you're running a business, and this is a business to support ourselves, because 50% of our income comes from our own efforts of selling products and services. We have over 40 income streams coming into Growing Power to support the work that we do. So it's important to make this an economic model, because that's how we've been able to change policy in the city of Milwaukee. So this is our new research, and Norman and his group from Bell Aquaculture supplied some of the equipment. We built this out from scratch, and now we'll be testing 5 different ways of growing lake perch in this system. A bunch of different hybrid filtering systems, from the conventional mechanical system to a system. This is heated by compost. It's also heated by solar. We have 70% of our hot water is derived from a solar system. We're also growing out food because there's still not a really good food for lake perch. So we're experimenting and doing research on black soldier fly larvae as a potential supplemental. Comes from that little fly right there, the larva. And this is the back 40 that you saw. We use a lot of renewable energy. Yes, sir.
Actually, you go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Nicole, and I am a farmer and urban gardener in Elkhart. And I would love it if people could introduce themselves at the microphone so we can continue to connect locally, too. And we're looking at gaining access to a lot of vacant city lots in the city of Elkhart. And one very practical question I have is if you have found good ways to continue building soil or even remediating really damaged soil that has lead contaminants or other things like that, what you've been doing.
Well, this is what we do. We don't have any digging equipment. We have no tractors, plows, rototillers. We grow soil. We put 2 feet by 36-inch wide beds, 18-inch pathways and between the beds, and this is our signature growing style right there.
So you're building up on top of your existing
We put down a layer of wood
surface.
chip. Then we get over time we get testing, tissue sample testing with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Test our fish samples of our fish tissue, our plant tissue, to make sure there's no contaminants, because that's really what counts, is after the crop, not necessarily testing the soil, but making sure that there's no contaminants being taken up by plants, or in the case of water, having good water quality for the fish to grow in. So that's what's important. So this is what we do, and we grow at $5 a square foot, which equates to about $200,000 an acre of production. We do this year-round without conventional heating system, without using fossil fuels. About 40 different crops we grow that way throughout the winter.
Hi.
Yes.
Well, I'll take that then. I'm Nick. I'm a student of environmental history and medical history here. And just sort of taking a lead off of Dr. Fernandez-Armesto's point, he brought up something I guess I'm recognizing is what's been called in the literature the McCowan thesis, where this idea that variety and an increase in food levels and varieties of food levels have played an extraordinary role in the population growth and buttressing against that sort of Malthusian pressure. And it seems though during that, the idea of this spinning off and becoming a big deal, there's been an undervalue of conversations with public health officials up until this point, which seems to relate directly to what we're doing here, trying to create healthier food systems, getting involved with sustainable soil production. However, I'm wondering, in the same way that we're now, that you yourself are now, it seems, working with public health officials, how well have you reached out to people dealing with, say, problems with invasive species, say, I've noticed a few animals popping up there that have been problem species in this area, and I'm wondering, do you work with labs such as our own Lodge Lab here to identify where possible risks are that could undermine what I think is a fantastic idea and worthy of our attention?
We're basically growing in a controlled environment. We have 25 acres of greenhouses now. We're on our way in the Milwaukee area to get up to 100 acres of greenhouses, because our goal as an organization is go from less than 1% of local food to 10% over the next several years, which will have huge implications in terms of job creation, different types of jobs. But when you're talking about invasive species, in agriculture there have always been invasive species. It's how you learn how to control them in an environmentally friendly way. We're not just throwing worms out into the forest, and I hear it from a lot of people that talk about worms. How are you controlling your worms? Well, the worms only travel 10 yards a year. They stay within their food zone. As long as there's food, the worms will stay where there's something to eat. So these fears I hear about don't really undermine. It's a matter of educating folks about those particular species. And a lot of the stuff that we do is around education and educating people, for example, of just growing food in a backyard or composting in a backyard to get the policies so that somebody can compost in their backyard. And many cities and many states have very restrictive policies about composting. So this is our new facility with a water tower, a 50,000 square foot building I bought last year. We're converting this into a fish hatchery because I know Norman's going to talk about the challenges of having enough fingerlings, and this is in a food desert. This particular project will create jobs. It'll rehab this building in a community that badly needs rehab. You can see the housing stock. But before we did that, we went in and we built hoop houses on the exterior to 2.5 acres. Our crew went in, we built 2 of these a day. These have been approved by the city. We get a permitting that we created the permitting ourselves. They use our schematic. Anybody who wants to build a hoop house in the city has to use our schematic that the city has approved, and we're able to grow last year 30,000 heads of head lettuce that went into Cisco, who we deliver to, that go into our public schools because Cisco is a delivery system into the public schools. And the only way to get that into the public schools is to work with Cisco. And this year we're growing 250,000 pounds of carrots, also kale, that'll go through Cisco. We're almost there.
We got 2 questions.
Okay.
2 brief questions.
Whoever's up next.
And then we'll have our break.
Okay. Well,
identifying yourself with the microphone.
Sure. Bob Benenson. I'm a freelance journalist from Chicago, and also do a lot of work with familyfarm.org, which is based in the Chicago area. And you're obviously a pioneer in growing indoors using hoop houses, aquaponics. You're doing some industrial reuse, as you just showed with the fish hatchery. Is there potential for vertical farming in the mix of what you're trying to accomplish?
Just hold on right now. You'll see it in a minute. Because that's our big project.
Okay.
So we grow mushrooms. Yes, ma'am.
I kind of have a question about, I guess, local organization of what you're trying to accomplish. Is Growing Power, I guess, trying to become a national impact, or is it something where you're trying to get other people to do what you're doing? Because my question is, if you're going to break up sustainable farming to smaller organizations, what incentivizes those organizations to protect the others? For instance, if some organization uses an insecticide that another organization does not want, but they're downstream, I'm kind of wondering how these, I guess, efforts can connect if you're going to say we should break up and do small farming.
Well, we're not trying to, I'm under no delusion that we're going to end industrial farming. It's not going to happen, probably in my lifetime. But we should be working toward giving people a choice of whether, when they walk into a grocery store, how many grocery stores, full-scale grocery stores, can you walk into the produce aisle and see a big sign that says locally grown? You don't see that. So what we need to do is be able to give people a choice of buying something that's locally grown. They don't have to spend 2 hours walking through the produce aisle looking for something locally grown. We're not trying to influence. What we do when people come in and we take them on tours of our facility to inspire them to go into action, because there's been a whole lot of talk and not enough action. So when you go into cities and you expect to see what you're seeing here, you won't see. So this is where we need to go.
So do you see Growing Power as supplemental to like a thriving city life? Because we've heard from a few people that they wanted to leave the farms to be able to go do other things. So my question is, in everything we're talking about today, the movement to go back, we keep saying go back to farming, there has to be someone who's not worrying about food, right? Because that's why we've had advances in healthcare, that's why our lifespans are longer. I mean, grain wasn't a bad thing in the long run.
Right.
But I guess I was just putting forth the thought that going back might not be the terminology we want to use, maybe integrating or
Well, I don't see,
supplementing.
let's think about young people that want to get into farming, because the new food system is not all about just putting a plant in the ground. It's about hundreds of different categories that I've illustrated here in terms of renewable energy, being able to grow soil, being able to engineer systems that can grow food. So there's hundreds of different categories that people can get involved in. As a matter of fact, I just started a think tank of under 40 young people, and they're over, what they have to figure out in their lifetime, in your lifetime, is how do we end world hunger? That's their big deal. And they come from all different perspectives. We've got kids that are in medical school, we have an engineer, we have the youngest venture capitalist who's 20 years old on board, and we'll be funding that through a scholarship fund that I have. They'll bring them in, stick them in a room, and let them go at it to figure out strategies on how to end world hunger. But this is just an example, and our goal as an organization is really to inspire, to get young people, because it's hard for young people to go out and buy a farm in a rural area. So in a city with all the land in cities, we're talking about Detroit, 169 square miles. The city is 90 square miles of vacant land, thousands of acres, potentially Milwaukee, all these major former steel belt cities, industrial cities. We're growing behind fire stations where we have hoop houses.
Well, Will, thanks for a great, inspiring presentation.
Okay.
And thanks to you for your inspiring.
I want to show just one more thing. I'll move real quick here because somebody asked, that's a cemetery, the future, working with Cisco in a partnership. The thing that I want to show you is will be the first vertical farm, truly vertical farm built in the world, will be in Milwaukee. We should break ground in 8 months. And it's at the very end here. It's worth waiting for, trust me.
Well, while we're waiting, you'll have the refreshments out there. Restrooms are out there. We'll try to get back in here as soon as we can. 10:35 at the latest we'll start the next panel.
Thank you very much.
We're going to wait for the vertical agriculture fields.
Will, I'm Miles Robertson. I actually visited Growing Power last summer with a group from South Bend. It was amazing. And we saw the plans for your vertical farm. You mentioned that you hope to break ground in 8 months. What would be a reason you wouldn't break ground in 8 months? And is there a way that people involved in the kind of relocalization of food and the food movement, even locally here in South Bend, Elkhart, whatever it may be, the Michiana area, can help with that?
Yeah, just come up and write me a check for $12 million, and we'll put your name on every door. We're in a capital campaign, a national capital campaign, to be able to get this building built. Everything is ready to go. The architectural renderings, the city approvals, everything. We're ready to go. We just need to finish, get to our halfway point of our fundraising, and then we're going to break ground. Get started.
Is there a website in which people can donate?
Growingpower.org. Yeah, we look at our website. There's a way to donate on our website. People can get involved. As a matter of fact, this is a school right here that we built in Madison, on the south side of Madison. That opened with the agricultural curriculum. We're almost there. 1,062 slots. We're at 8:30. These are some of the projects that we worked on over the years with the Blackfeet out in Montana and down south. We have 15 regional training centers that we signed 5
year contracts. This is probably the most aesthetically pleasing garden in the country. This is in Chicago, in Grant Park. Brought down 100,000 pounds of compost. This is the Cabrini Green in Chicago. Another garden that was funded by the Fourth Presbyterian Church in downtown Chicago. This is our new home base in Iron Street on the south side of Chicago. This is in Grant Park. This is downtown Chicago. These are schools in Chicago with gardens on asphalt, concrete, and senior gardens. And we were at the Chicago Flower and Garden Show the last 4 years. And these young people would probably be doing something different. This is our CSA bag of food that we give out in our work in Kenya and Ukraine and Central London. And we have all these regional training centers at Fort Valley State, Mount Bayou, Mississippi, the oldest black township. They were started by 2 slaves after the Civil War. 7 Harvest. Obesity rates in Mississippi are over 50%. Now West Virginia is taking over the lead, so it's still growing. Problem is still growing. In Minnesota, where they'll probably build a second vertical farm. I'm working with a group in Minnesota that wants to build. This is Detroit, where there are no retail grocery stores in the city of Detroit. In Columbus, Ohio, in Cleveland, at the Forgotten Triangle, 26-acre, and Blair Grocery in the 9th Ward. This young man came down from New York, Bed-Stuy. So this is happening in all communities. People want to eat healthy food and put it into their systems. At District of Columbia, University of District of Columbia is growing food in Beltsville, growing soil in Beltsville, Maryland. Excavated the site for them. Now they're growing soil for the projects in DC. In the future, this is it. It'll be able to house 400 people if we have a conference. It'll have a teaching kitchen, a large the bottom is a large retail grocery store, 2nd floor. We have a greenhouse and house 400 people, classrooms. We're working with the local universities. We're going to have a Urban Nutrition and Agricultural Institute with students with masters and PhD students studying the food system from all schools at the universities. Thank you.
Great.